We gotta talk about Avowed. Xbox was kind enough to give me 2-week early access to review Avowed, and I'm just so conflicted on this game. And pay attention here, because I think for a lot of you watching right now, you're going to feel very similar to me as you eventually play Avowed. Because just keeping it honest, Avowed was a complete mixed bag for me. Some things about this game I really enjoyed and found consistently engaging, but I also found things that just led to consistent eye rolling. And there's one very big aspect about Avowed which will lead to several of you just skipping this one, at least for the time being. And as we get into this one, I won't be sharing any major spoilers around the game or its major questing. But overall, the thing for me with Avowed is this game does get a lot right. I had a weird experience with this one where in the early hours, I almost didn't review Avowed in the first place. I was pretty close to just putting the game down because I wasn't enjoying it. But thankfully, as you start to get a bit more into the story, unlock some new abilities for your character, and even find some items, things do come together to be particularly enjoyable, at least to a point. I found that a lot of Avowed can be pretty tropey, and that includes the main story. The scary plague is wreaking havoc on the living lands, and we are dispatched to investigate and eventually solve it. But along the way, there's another big bad that'll pop up as something we'll have to deal with. The people of Aora of the living lands end up becoming as much a part of this main story as the plague is. But of course, this is all from Obsidian, so I did have particularly high expectations for the questing here and even the dialogue. And thankfully, I can report that a lot of this did deliver. Something you'll notice throughout this review is I found a lot of things about Avowed good, but then in other instances quite bad. The question overall here is what you would expect from Obsidian. You consistently had multiple paths forward with each quest, and in very familiar Obsidian style, many quests left you with a big option to just fight it out if you want to. With a ton of the encounters in this game, you can either end things peacefully via dialogue, end things angrily via dialogue, or just kill everyone. And oftentimes in my playthrough, I just chose to kill everyone, which definitely changed up the game for me, because just killing everyone was often a more difficult path forward and could potentially aggro an entire area of the map to your current group. But definitely is fun to have that choice, a perhaps slightly more difficult path forward, but yeah, you can kill a lot of people in Avowed, which I personally loved. To go along with this, there are a ton of speech checks all throughout this game. How you build out your character will have a major impact on what choices are available to you in dialogue, and in turn, what kind of choices you'll be making during questing. And pretty similar to how it worked in the Outer Worlds, companions end up playing a much larger role in both your quests and combat in Avowed. You'll have the typical companion dialogue that you could do back at your camp, but also just companions butting in with their own opinions. And a feature I personally loved is, before a lot of the major choices during the main story, you could just ask your companions what they thought about a certain thing to help inform your ultimate decision. But while I liked this overall, I was also consistently rolling my eyes throughout this story, and that was largely just due to the writing. It's one of those weird situations where at points I was taking notes praising the game for how realistic and nuanced certain conversations were. At some points in this game, when you're talking to another character, you're talking about some very real issues that you probably have feelings on in real life. And you did have the ability to articulate those feelings in game to a very adequate degree. It definitely felt like the dialogue was consistently there to roleplay how you like, at least for the most part. But other times, it really felt like high school banter. Two of the companions playfully dislike each other, and some of the comments made here just sound ridiculous and completely took me out of the game for a moment. And throughout the game, it was this weird back and forth for me. Lots of the dialogue was great, but then some of it's just bad. So it kind of averaged out to being pretty good. The good definitely outweighs the bad here, but I also found a lot of the NPC appearances to just kind of be a bit odd. And perhaps this is more on the nitpicky side, but to me, it just felt like a lot of these NPCs didn't look like they fit into a medieval fantasy setting. A ton of the people looked surprisingly modern, like modern beauty standards are being employed here. It wasn't a huge deal one way or another, but I did notice this with several characters and sort of just wish they had a simpler look for many. And the story overall is in a similar situation for me. At times, I am super engaged in this story. I saw some genuine jaw-dropping moments. But then at other times, you just want to skip through the dialogue because things become so incredibly tropey and predictable. Unfortunately, without giving spoilers, I can't really share more about this, but several aspects of Avowed just feel very familiar. Like I've already done this in another game, and overall, it's just kind of fine. The individual dialogue was pretty engaging throughout this game, and definitely a strong point overall, but the overarching story notes did feel pretty generic at points. Not enough to not finish the story. It's not like you're going to turn the game off because the story's too generic, but also wasn't a huge driving force forward. I wasn't so engaged in the story that I couldn't put Avowed down. And this was also true for a lot of the side quests. Plenty of the stories told in this world are just not really that interesting or feel very familiar, like you've already done them in another game. Although one thing I will say is this story is surprisingly long. The game definitely feels larger than the Outer Worlds in comparison, and while overall Avowed definitely still feels like a smaller title, it definitely doesn't feel as small as the Outer Worlds, which I would definitely consider a big upgrade. But the feeling of familiarity is something I felt throughout a lot of my time with Avowed. This game just kind of has a certain layer of generic Unreal Engine RPG features, and I definitely don't mean that in a good way. This open world is definitely not a strong point. Visually, it's great looking. Over the course of the story, you're going to go to additional areas, and each of these have their own overarching theme, and the landscape here is stunning. This is definitely one of those games where you're going to stop to take it all in because things look so good. But you also shouldn't expect a particularly high degree of open world interactivity, which I think is going to burn a lot of people on this game. You can go around and loot items, trade with vendors and things like that, and actually when it comes to looting or stealing, nobody cares. I guess from a story perspective, this is due to us being the envoy. We are sent directly by the Emperor, but in Avowed, you can just walk into someone's house, steal every lootable item there, and they won't say a word to you. That felt odd to me. Lots of the NPCs feel fairly dead in this game until you actually engage in dialogue with them. Like, even just walking around certain towns, the city would be stunning. Things look amazing all around you, but then you actually look around and everyone's just kind of standing there lifelessly, not really doing anything. The wilderness could definitely be a bit better at times. You can find some enemies patrolling around, but overall, this is a fairly basic open world, particularly from an RPG perspective. Exploration was fine, but it's not a selling point. And I would say it's pretty similar to the Outer Worlds here. There are occasionally things to find out there, but the vast majority of the time, you're just going to be looting some crafting components. And I think why this felt like a bigger issue with Avowed compared to other games is because this world was stunning. Lots of the major set pieces are pretty enough that you want to stop and take it all in, but as you do so, you also see how dead this world is at points, and that does kind of take away from the visuals to a degree. I was hopeful for some New Vegas-esque sneak around to find a secret back door to open up a new quest pathway, but at least in my experience, that really isn't a consideration with Avowed, or it very rarely was. Although crafting and upgrading your gear is a major part of this game, you have typical items, but also unique items with some special abilities on them. This is a fairly dumbed down system. Most of the loot you're going to find on enemies, from chests, and even during quests is going to be crafting components or common pieces of weapon and armor. So often just being a generic weapon or armor that you can break down into more crafting components. And this aspect of the game is just kind of fine. Upgrade gear to get better stats, and there's even an enchanting mechanic for unique weapons, but it's one of those systems where pretty quickly you're going to find what you like for your character, and then it's just, okay, let me upgrade this over and over and then scrap a bunch of the stuff I don't need. Pretty quickly I found the gear and upgrade system to be more cumbersome than enjoyable. There's no mechanics around building weapons of your own or developing your own skills here, which is not really a bad or good thing. It's just a simpler, more neutral feature of the game. But something that isn't super simple is combat. Combat is a major focus of Avowed because basically all of the abilities that you're going to unlock will be combat focused, and this includes the abilities of your companions. As you travel around and level up, your companions will unlock new abilities, and pretty quickly you'll be using all kinds of moves in combat. The core of this is what combat style you invest into. They're going to be swords, bows, wands, magic books, and even guns, but Avowed features this very easy weapon swap feature, so you'll probably adopt multiple of these in some kind of hybrid playstyle. In the early game, I found the combat to be outright boring. It's simple hack and slash combat of spamming abilities at enemies. But thankfully, as you start to hit the mid-game and start to unlock more, this definitely becomes more engaging. Mostly because there's just more for you to do. You can chain together certain abilities and know when to best use your companion's abilities. A big part of this is, while some abilities will just increase damage with a certain item type, a ton of the abilities you unlock are going to be a new thing your character can do. So it does become very engaging as you level up and literally are learning new powers for your character. And some of these fights where I am spam clicking spells are incredibly fun. It gets really engaging with a ton for you to do yourself and companions, and overall companions are a very relevant part of combat. Obsidian managed to make companions feel like they actually are playing a role in those fights, which is really nice. As well as Avowed does feature several boss fights as you're adventuring around to help mix things up. Although this too is only fun up until a point. The combat definitely is a highlight of the game overall, but at the end of the day, you're just kind of spamming abilities at fairly tanky enemies. There isn't much nuance in your strategy. The end goal is often to just kill everyone as quickly as possible. I think particularly when you're coming from another game like Stalker or Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and then going to Avowed, things just feel dumbed down and incredibly easy to get into in Avowed. It simply lacks the nuance that many of these other games have around their combat encounters and how you approach them and how you can strategize with them. And one of the big problems I had with Avowed's combat is it just kind of feels familiar. The focus on abilities is nice, but it's not like anything particularly new or revolutionary is happening here. And I feel like that's kind of one of the big issues with Avowed overall. This game is just fine to pretty good, but a lot of what it does has been done by other games. And at least for me, while you're playing this one, things felt familiar. Avowed isn't a revolutionary game, which is typically fine, but it is releasing in the middle of a bunch of other fairly revolutionary games, which I think is a bit of a problem for this one. Another problem is the bugs. So of course, I was playing on an early build of Avowed, and some of this may be fixed, but I crashed about 8 times while playing this one, and my FPS was consistently not great. I played Avowed maxed out at 4K on a 4090, but my FPS still was surprisingly low throughout. This definitely feels like one of those poorly optimized Unreal Engine games that's heavily relying on DLSS or FSR to get working. During tons of conversations with just one other NPC, I am in the 60s of FPS, and you could definitely feel it. A lot of my playtime with Avowed was under 100 FPS on a fairly top-tier system, and it's not like the game looks that good. As a recent comparison, I would say my FPS in Avowed was typically 30 to 50 lower when compared to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 or even Cyberpunk 2077. So like, yeah, I get it, playing above 60 FPS is obviously great for 90% of games, but it just felt weird with Avowed. It felt like my FPS should have been higher, and some of the FPS jumps you feel while playing are substantial. A lot of this led to minor hiccups in the game, sometimes visual artifacting as things would adjust or try and load in to catch up, and overall I would say the FPS fluctuations and some of the visual issues made this feel just not like a super polished experience. Avowed has a lot of FPS jumps for me, and yeah, you really feel these. It's not like you're just seeing your FPS change on the stat. No, I was noticing it in gameplay and then like, oh, is my FPS shifting or something? It can definitely take you out of the game for a moment, and I have to imagine this will be something you experience on consoles, particularly if you want higher FPS. I also encountered just some general bugs, lots of small audio issues where sound would cut out temporarily.
Wine.
Not really the end of the world, but considering this game was supposedly done last year and has been in polishing for months, I certainly found this many bugs surprising. Comparing Avowed to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, the same game I just reviewed a couple of weeks ago, I had significantly more problems with Avowed in significantly less playtime. Like, even as just a simple example, I think I just couldn't complete this bounty quest. I had to go and kill some big ogre enemy, but I think he just burned, so I could never loot the items off his body, and in turn, never get my reward for completing this bounty. This seemingly happened with 2 different bounties. Although thankfully beyond that and some of the weird audio and FPS issues, those were really all of the bugs I encountered with Avowed. I wouldn't say it was a particularly buggy game, but some of the FPS fluctuations and crashing do become a bigger issue over the course of a larger playtime. And overall, it's one of those weird situations where Avowed definitely isn't a bad game. It's just not better than a lot of the alternatives available right now, at least for me. After this video goes up, I am going back to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and probably going to check out this big Stalker 2 update that is about to drop. I don't really plan to play more Avowed, not because it's a bad game, but again, just because there are better alternatives right now. I think the release window here is incredibly competitive, and in my opinion, Avowed loses to the competition. To me, the biggest takeaway with Avowed is it just kind of feels like a generic Unreal Engine RPG. A lot of this is enjoyable moment to moment, but a lot of it also feels familiar, and this definitely isn't a revolutionary game or really trying to do all that much new. But simply, this is not a game I would rush to play. That's not to say you won't have fun with it, but there are other games that are offering more unique and memorable experiences right now. Avowed feels like a game that was built with Game Pass in mind. I think if this was dropping in an era without Game Pass, the game itself would look a lot different. But those are my overall thoughts on Avowed. Many of you are going to be jumping into this one in just a couple of hours, so I'd love to hear from you guys down below. What are your initial impressions of Avowed, or even just what do you think after watching some reviews? Otherwise, get subscribed because we have a lot more RPG content coming on the channel.